Okay, students, so next video is about pragmatics, quick revision tool, analysing pragmatics. What is it then? What's pragmatics? Well, it's not that difficult to get to grips with pragmatics. It's the study of meaning in context. Anything that's implied meaning that is beneath the surface, or contextual meaning. You will be analysing pragmatic meaning anytime you make a suggestion about what a language feature implies. You do this all the time. This implies, this suggests, in context this means. It's important to recognise that you were doing this anyway. We just want to let you have the tools to be able to do it in a bit more specific, a bit more sophisticated way. Now, in spoken text and transcripts, pragmatic meaning covers things like the implications that a certain speaker makes, the attitude of the participant, what they're feeling beneath the surface. It's things that are meant in the context of the conversation. Okay, so we all know that if we say something in one conversation, it would have a very, very different meaning from saying it in a different conversation. So that's about the context influencing the meaning. But in written text, it's things like the implied meanings in a text, what's beneath the surface. This phrase, reading between the lines, it's not really what we're asking you to do. It's more like reading what's on the lines, but sort of more sophisticatedly in a better way. It covers things like the attitude of the writer. It covers things like tenor, and it covers things like stereotyping and assumptions made by writers. Now, it's almost inevitable that students want to do a pragmatics paragraph, but I'd really sort of argue against that. It's more a part of addressing the bullet points. So we don't really want you to do a separate pragmatics paragraph unless that's something that the text is screaming for you to consider. But you must consider meanings in context for both section A on the written on the spoken text and section B on the written text. You must consider pragmatic meaning in context in order to address the bullet points, in order to show how language is used to address the purpose and how it's used in context for the written text, and of course how it's used as a sort of spoken language feature to make implications, to express the attitudes of the participants, things like that, for the spoken language of the media, section A question. So, simple stuff then, let's have a look at that quotation. A distinguished but elderly scientist states that something is possible. He's almost certainly right. When he states that something is impossible, he's very probably wrong. Arthur C. Clarke. Very, very simply, all we want to think about is tenor. You're doing this all the time in your explanations, but it's just taking a little bit more time, maybe even in an overview, to consider the overall tenor, the overall attitude taken by the writers towards the subject matter and towards the reader, the feel of the text. It's really about the attitude, or what was the writer's attitude towards that subject matter and towards the reader. So perhaps you could say, well, he sounds a bit superior here, doesn't he? He's trying to be perhaps knowledgeable. He's stating it very clearly as a declarative. He's stating, like, oh, he is almost certainly right, is very probably wrong. It's very, very direct sort of tenor there. That might try to express an attitude of being superior or intellectual or very, very knowledgeable. You can also talk about stereotyping here as well. We'll get onto this a little bit later when it comes to gender, but you can hopefully see that he's crafting an image, a sort of stereotype of a scientist, a distinguished but elderly. So perhaps a stereotype of older people being stuck in their ways. When an old person says it's impossible, they're probably wrong. Perhaps the stereotype of older people is that they're experienced, that they're distinguished. Both of those stereotypes are being used, and so analysing the crafting of those stereotypes through other things such as lexis, semantics, grammatical construction, connotations, that adds to a discussion of the pragmatic meaning within the text. On to more complex stuff, with the same quotation, we can think about things like cultural allusions. Please, please, please make sure you're spelling that correctly. It's not an illusion, it's not something that's an illusion, as in it's not real, it's an allusion, it's a reference. So a reference to something in culture, a reference to something that not everybody would understand. When he says something is impossible, when a scientist says something is impossible, is that a reference to a particular scientist? Einstein, for example, famously wasn't particularly keen on quantum theory. Now, only some people would know that. Perhaps there's a little veiled little dig at scientists that get a bit stuck in their ways, even people who are as sophisticated and successful as Einstein. Perhaps it's playing on a cultural stereotype or cultural understanding of science, that they often make mistakes and that sometimes they're a bit stuck in their ways. Does it demand a certain knowledge of the history of science? Is it very sophisticated in that way? Now, the really important point about pragmatics is you don't need to know this. You don't need to know about Einstein. You don't need to know about cultural understanding of science to recognise that there's something going on. It does demand something of the reader. You might not be the target audience, you might not be the person who knows, but you should be able to see that it is making that demand. It's going to mean more to somebody who does know. Intertextuality is a type of cultural allusion that might be going on here. So it's a type of cultural allusion to another text or to another sort of media form, like a film. So you might not know that Arthur C. Clarke is a writer, but if you did, you'd be in a really, really good position to say how that influences the meaning of this statement. He's a science fiction writer, so if you know that, it changes the meaning of the text. So maybe they'll give you some of this information for a text in one of the descriptors, in one of the just before the question, and so that type of information might change the meaning. So in context, those intertextual references, it's a reference to sort of Arthur C. Clarke as a writer, that might change the meaning of the text. Right, onto the really, really complicated stuff then. So we've got gender assumptions and cultural allusions. So you should be able to see that it uses the male third person pronoun he to refer to any scientist. A scientist, and yet he uses the pronoun he, which suggests sort of sexist gender attitudes. We can talk about associations of males with science. Traditionally, it's seen as quite a masculine subject in culture. We can talk about the use of implicature, making implications about things. So perhaps Clarke is using a certain phrase to imply something about scientists. Distinguished but elderly is a form of implicature. Maybe he's implying something about old people or elderly people. Right, finally then, stuff to revise. You need to know about tenor, that's the sort of attitude of the writer, the feel of the text. Stereotyping, implicature, making particular implications about things. Cultural allusions, please spell it right. Intertextual references, references to other writers or texts or films. Attitudes and cultural assumptions. This is right across the breadth of what we do. Does the text make a particular attitude? Is the writer making a particular assumption about something? If it's a spoken text, is a particular speaker have it displaying a certain attitude or a particular assumption? And fundamentally make sure you're thinking about meaning in context, in the context of the conversation, in the context of how this is read, in the context of where it's read, what happens to the meanings of the text. Okay, that concludes our Pragmatics revision video.